Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Homes Within Reach. Make sure everyone's in the right place today. The title of today's session is Equitable Community Planning for Inclusive Growth. My name is Flora Arabu. I'm the National Director for State and Local Policy at Enterprise Community Partners, and I will be your moderator for this session. So today we're going to be covering three key topics. The first is going to be equitable recovery. So, what is it? What does it look like? How can precious resources be targeted to the hardest hit areas and to our most vulnerable residents? Inclusive and equitable planning. Again, what is it? How is it done? How can a lens of COVID and the Black Lives Matter movement inform inclusive and equitable planning? And finally, resident engagement. How has engagement changed during COVID, and how can we make sure that those most impacted by decisions continue to have a seat at the table? I'd like to quickly introduce our two speakers today. First, we have Cece Gerlack. After graduating from Cedar Crest College, Cece worked for several nonprofits in Allentown, including the Boys and Girls Club and the Caring Place. Cece was elected to the Allentown School Board in 2011, where she served for 8 years. She has been a bold community organizer and advocate for more inclusive and equitable development policies. Cece was then elected to the Allentown City Council in 2019, where her focus has been homelessness, affordable housing, and police reform. She has worked as a teacher and is currently a street outreach worker with homeless youth. And our second speaker today is Matt Madia. So as the Director of Real Estate Services, Matt Madia leads the efforts to build out, test, and model the products and resources needed to fully launch the centralized real estate accelerator. The accelerator is a bold, new, comprehensive, and centralized community-based real estate model aimed at increasing the capital flow, economic opportunity, and transforming the lives of traditionally underserved residents. Prior to joining Neighborhood Allies, Matt served as Chief Strategy and Development Officer at Bridgeway Capital. Matt brings with him a decade of financial tool development in the development sector and also brings expertise in small business, manufacturing, and food-related business needs to the team. So with those introductions, I'd like to ask everyone who's listening to please submit your questions as the speakers are talking. We'll be going through your questions so we can make sure they're queued up for the Q&A. And with that, I'll invite Councilmember Gerlack to share her screen and begin presenting.
Okay, so let me just get in the correct mode here. All right, so first off, thank you for those of you who are joining this session. I hope you find it informative. So as was shared by Flora, I was elected to City Council just over a year ago, and in my research, I've been able to find different policies that other cities have put into place, not only in Pennsylvania, but throughout the country, that really formalize the engagement process with residents. What I have found as a resident before I got on council is that far too often when we finally engage residents, the writing on the wall, it's done. The decisions have been made, and we kind of just bring them in at the end just to say that we've brought residents in. I equate it to the example of we invite people to the table, but the food's already been ordered, the menus have been taken away, so they're just kind of there to fill a seat. So in my research, finding policies that aim to change that, knowing that there is no perfect policy, and that with every legislative action there are some downfalls. I'll be focusing on those three areas. but also knowing that there are a plethora of other avenues to engage folks in the community. And then towards the end, I'll be talking about, if I have time, I don't want to go too far into it. I'll be talking about some of the non-policy related ways, but just outreach efforts that we've made as a city pre-COVID and during COVID to engage our residents. So I think one of the crucial questions to ask ourselves is if we want to go back to normal, which wasn't working for many people, or if we want to actually create structural change. Because when we talk about community engagement, when we talk about resident engagement, Black Lives Matter, COVID, what we've really kind of seen over the last year is that for many of us, we knew that cracks and sometimes huge canyons existed in the system, but now it's been put to the forefront. And so my assessment is we can't go back to normal because normal wasn't working, that this is the time where we can really dig in and start to realign, reimagine, and start to create these structural changes within our systems and how we actually engage with people, to take it from performative to actual, like, meaningful, authentic engagement. So these are some of the policies I have found: community impact reports, community benefits agreements, and designating official resident groups that actually have voting power in development decisions. So just to kind of go through community impact reports real quickly, being on council, I've noticed that there are a lot of decisions that get made, through the planning commission, the zoning board, and what have you. And by the time the residents actually find out what's happening, it's too late. It's before us at council, or it's before some other voting body, and the decision is made. So what a community impact report does is try to mitigate some of the negative impacts of development. First off, it just acknowledges that there are negative impacts to development, and instead of trying to pretend that development is perfect and that all boats will rise with the building of this new project, it acknowledges that there may be a loss of green space, there may be a loss of some affordable housing, and let's just put that on the table and see if there's ways we can mitigate that. Something I would see that a community impact report would really help in Allentown would be to bring the developer and the community to the table from the beginning. So as a way to hopefully prevent some of those adversarial relationships that I've seen on council, and that frankly, before getting on council as an activist, that I've been part of. But if you get people at the table from the beginning to identify some of those negative impacts with the developer, there's a potential that instead of development being done to a community, it can be done with a community. So part of a community impact report, we go to the next slide, it really digs deep. It doesn't just look at how many jobs are going to come from this project. It really looks at the types of jobs, because that's what people that I hear from residents, especially those who are in marginalized groups and who have been systemically disenfranchised for centuries, that when development happens and we say that X number of jobs are coming, but then the skill set of the people in the community don't match the jobs that are coming, there's a mismatch there. So CIR not only acknowledges that, but then presents a way of possibly addressing that mismatch. And then it also looks at a number of other issues that you can see right there, especially in terms of displacement, where especially if you're in a landlocked municipality like we are in Allentown, there's only so much space. So sometimes in order to build new, you've got to knock something down, and sometimes what that that building that you're knocking down could actually, it could be an asset to the community, that from an outside perspective, without doing a CIR, one would never really know it, unless you are actually engaging with the folks in the neighborhood. It's just a building. And so the next policy that is more widely used is a community benefits ordinance. So a community benefits ordinance, I should say first that there's a community benefits agreement, which is an agreement between the developer and the community, that there will be tangible benefits for the residents of a neighborhood where the project's happening. So we're talking jobs, grocery stores, recreational opportunities, affordable housing, things like that. And there are multiple community benefits agreements throughout this country that really bring the community into the planning process. Again, this is about from the onset, not after the documents have been signed. And the only difference between a community benefits agreement and an ordinance is the ordinance aspect. So the only ordinance I could find is in Detroit. And in Detroit, it's an actual law where, you know, if you are building a project of a certain magnitude, that you must go out to the community and you must meet with them before it even goes through the bureaucratic system. And you know, and this has resulted in some pretty good projects in terms of recreational opportunities and affordable housing opportunities for residents. Now, part of that is you have to have a neighborhood advisory council for that impact area. So these are residents that actually have a voting say-so on what gets done in their neighborhood and what benefits are going to be implemented into the project, such as the jobs and affordable housing. And you can see the details of what a neighborhood advisory council is. But the important thing is a lot of towns and municipalities have, you know, neighborhood groups. We do, but what they lack is the official capacity to really have an influence in an official way. They can advise, they can show up to different meetings, they can speak under courtesy of the floor, but there's no mechanism for their comments to really carry the same weight as, say, a developer. So the community benefits that can come from a neighborhood advisory council really vary. It just depends on the project and it depends on the neighborhood. Like I said, the only thing I could find in Pennsylvania that would come close to this would be in Pittsburgh and Philly. More so Pittsburgh in the Hill District, they have a community benefits agreement, or at least they did. And then I know there's a council member in Philadelphia, that is pursuing making a mandated community benefits agreement for large development projects. But this leads to the community organizations, where if there's a community organization like in Philadelphia, I know I've spoken with a council member there, and I know that their RCOs, sometimes they're not as effective as or I shouldn't say effective, as the outcomes aren't as equitable as they should be, just because in one neighborhood you could have an RCO made up of architects and engineers, just because that's the makeup of that neighborhood, and then in another neighborhood you could have an RCO made up of, you know, teachers and construction workers who maybe don't have the same access to the development information. So there are some downsides to some of these policies, but nonetheless, it's worth pursuing, because with a registered community organization, that's just another way to guarantee that there's going to be a formal, ongoing relationship between the developer and the neighborhood to ensure that that development project is actually going to meet the neighborhood's needs. So stop screen sharing. And so, I mean, the reason why focusing on these specific policies, again, these are the main policies I could find that would actually formalize participation. But as we, as we come off of a summer of protest and as we continue to live through this pandemic, we see again that there are structural issues, and structural issues sometimes can be addressed with a program or a new director or a new initiative, but sometimes they just require revamping a system and how we do things. And if we have people in our communities who are continuing to say, specifically Black and Brown people who are continuing to say, we feel left out, we do not feel heard, well, then that requires us to do some internal reflection and figure out how do we change the system and the way that we are reaching out to folks, because it obviously isn't working, or they wouldn't have those feelings. So I would say the last thing for my portion is I'm proud to say that in Allentown, we have this program called Inside Allentown, where we partnered with a nonprofit, and it can happen online as well, but during COVID times. But we partnered with a nonprofit and we brought people in from the community who were just interested in how city government works. What does a public works director do? What does the public works director staff do? Like, people don't know the intricacies of municipal government, and to help them when they are maybe advocating for their neighborhood for or against a project, be on somewhat of a equal playing field in terms of a knowledge base. So they came in, they learned about every single department, asked questions, and what I would like to see this expanded into would be some type of paid internship, so that those folks who came in, they learned the basics about how a city functions and interacts, how the different departments interact with each other. There were people who really were just into it, and I would love to see those folks be able to get a job with the city and maybe one of those departments. So, as we move along with COVID, it will be interesting to see how we're able to develop that into something more than what we have. But that's all I've got. I look forward to any questions and listening to Matt's presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, council member. That sounds like a really exciting partnership, and your presentation, was so impressive in how significant it is for the moment that we're in. So thank you. Now I'd like to turn it over to Matt. And again, I encourage all of you to be submitting your questions using CVent, and we will be going through them later. So go ahead, Matt. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Flora. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So thanks, and thanks everyone for tuning into this session. Thank you, Councilwoman. I hope that that my presentation can be a good complement to yours. And I'm really going to take more of the developer perspective, I think here, but hopefully an equitable development perspective. As Flora said in my bio, we Neighborhood Allies launched this real estate accelerator last year. And me and my team are working with nonprofit organizations, particularly CDCs, as well as small business owners and developers, the vast majority of which are Black developers who are, first time or very inexperienced developers who need some technical assistance on how the development process works, how to put together your pro formas or financial models, how to secure your site and develop it, as well as experienced developers who are looking to level up. So someone who is owning or developing a 4-unit apartment building and then wants to take that into a multi-million, wants their next project to be a multi-million-dollar project. And across the board, the goal for us is community ownership. It's to increase the number of real estate assets owned by residents of the community, particularly people of color. It's to increase the value of those assets, and it's to make sure that that ownership is sustainable for the long term. Just to start, I wanted to take a minute to sort of talk about the state of the real estate market, at least as I know it to be in Pittsburgh. It's right now a seller's market on the residential side in a way that I've never seen. And we don't have data for this on 2020 yet, but any broker or agent that I've talked to, and anybody else like me that pays attention to this stuff, inventory is really low. And there are, anything that's priced appropriately goes off the market in a matter of days. And there are homes in a number of neighborhoods in Pittsburgh that are going above asking price, which for anyone that grew up or lived in Pittsburgh in the 80s or 90s, the idea that a home in the city of Pittsburgh would go above asking price is absolutely unbelievable. So on the residential side, we're continuing to see a surge in interest and activity despite the pandemic. And that's also true on the development side. So certainly in 2020, because of the pandemic, we're going to see a downturn in construction permits. But if you look at the period from May to December, after we got out of the sort of worst parts of the lockdown, you see actually an increase year over year from 2019, about 5% on permits issued in the city of Pittsburgh. And then the cost of those projects is also increasing. The average permit cost is up about 7%. So we're more projects and larger or possibly just more expensive projects. And part of that is because we're seeing construction costs increase. And I think that that's probably true across the state, across the country. It's been the case for a number of years, in large part driven by just demand and tight labor. But now we also see, because of COVID, that construction material costs are going up. There was a period of time last year where simple things like literally studs and drywall you couldn't get reliably. Now we're seeing long lead times on delivery of basic things like windows and doors, and so that's all contributing to a rise in costs. We also work on commercial projects. We do both residential and commercial, and the commercial market's really not bad. You would expect, if you'd said we were going to be 10 months into this pandemic and most people would be working from home and nobody would be shopping, you'd expect both of these markets to sort of crater. Certainly they're not as healthy as they were, and there's a lot of uncertainty, particularly around retail. But in our experience and from the data that we see, there's at least some cause for optimism in those sectors. And so then what about community development? What about the places and the people that we all care about? So the first thing that I think we have to say is that COVID-19 has really disproportionately affected Black and Brown communities, both the disease, both the health part of this and the economic part. And, hopefully we will get back to some state of normalcy sometime this year in a few months, but we have to keep this point, and it's the reason I listed number one. We have to keep it in mind because it's just another trauma that we're layering on to the communities we work with, and so we're going to have to be extra vigilant about making sure the work we do doesn't forget what's happened here. But despite that, and I think in consistent with the last slide, I continue to see really high levels of interest in the low-income communities that we work with, often from outside of the community, which has the potential for displacement and other negative effects, but also really from inside the community as well. And that's something we're really excited about. A lot of ambitious plans. We've seen them just in the last few weeks. People do not seem to be taking a position of retrenchment or deciding that they need to hold off on plans because of the state of the economy or the health emergency. They're really moving forward, and that's exciting to be a part of, and I think is a silver lining here. The other thing that's going on, of course, in addition to COVID, is post George Floyd's murder, we saw all of these commitments from banks, from corporations, from philanthropy to advance equity in their communities, which are certainly welcome, and a lot of them have potentially big price tags. But I think it's incumbent upon, certainly in my work and a lot of you all, to make sure that we are holding them accountable and making sure that that those commitments are geared toward the communities in the right way, and that they're not just sort of PR commitments. And then the last thing I think that's a factor here that we're keeping an eye on is, what's the new administration going to do? One, that's going to, potentially be new stimulus. We went through at Neighborhood Allies a lot of effort to make sure that PPP loans were available to, really small businesses, especially minority-owned businesses that were maybe only 1 or 2 person shops, to make sure that they weren't shut out of that program, and had some success in doing that. What's the next stimulus program going to be, and how can we mobilize to make sure that money gets to communities that often aren't used to getting these kind of benefits from these kind of programs. And so that's why I think the focus for us in this upcoming year is really meeting the moment, or meeting these various moments. And for me, it's a balance between what's urgent and what we can't lose sight of in the long term. So again, in the near term, all of this new stimulus, all of these new programs, we need to work to make sure that we bring them to our communities. Holding corporations accountable, as I said, I saw a corporation, I won't name it, but was looking for to invest in Black developers and put out a RFP or something like that. And one of the criteria was that the developer or the firm that would be led by individual of color had to have experience. Phrase it something like had to have $50 million in assets under management or development experience. Well, that's a pretty high bar for anyone, let alone if we're talking about investing in communities where asset values are undervalued, assets are undervalued, and people often don't have equity to get to the highest levels of development. You're really setting a bar that's almost impossible to reach. So we have to communicate back to the people making these commitments to make sure that the way they're structuring them is appropriate. And then we're going to continue, as I said, to have this health crisis, and also there's a looming eviction crisis coming. I'm certainly not an expert in that, but I'm really happy to see that there's been a couple of sessions on, how do we deal with rental assistance? How do we deal with evictions? Because it's going to be, I think, dominating our conversation for the year and maybe beyond, unfortunately. But the long-term challenges, and they're really maybe should be more viewed as opportunities as far as we're concerned, and what we're working on is, again, pushing for community ownership of assets and increasing the value of those assets now, while they're still attainable in some of our low-income communities where those assets are undervalued. Building the talent pipeline. So we just need more Black and brown developers to take advantage of these opportunities in their communities before it's too late. And part of that is both a cause and an effect of that work is the racial equity, the wealth gap. And if we're expecting everyone to come with 20% down come to the table with 20% down, if we're only lending at 80% LTV in these neighborhoods, we're never going to be able to accomplish that. So we need to grapple with those realities. I'm going to skip ahead here because I want to talk about, I think, to make our work seem a little bit more concrete and real, and just go through a quick example of a client that we're working with at Neighborhood Allies. So Big Tom Boyd is a barber. He's rented his barber shop at 2042 Center Avenue. I include the addresses here because you can see these aren't very far away. The Urban Redevelopment Authority put several properties on the market, including the one you see here in the picture, which coincidentally used to be a barbershop called Ham's Barbershop. And we helped Big Tom secure the negotiating rights to this building. So what this is going to allow him to do is, of course, relocate, have a, his space now is nice. This space will be a little bit larger. But really, obviously, the advantages are he's going to own the building. There will be 4 apartments on those upper floors that you see there. So that's going to be additional income for him. This is a intersection with a lot of traffic. So we think that this will be a location and a piece of real estate that's only going to appreciate in value and will be very, very visible on Center Avenue. And this is, I'm sorry, I didn't say, this is in the Hill District, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. It's just east of downtown Pittsburgh. It's a historically and culturally important Black neighborhood for decades. And so we're helping him now that he has these exclusive negotiating rights with the Urban Redevelopment Authority to plan for the project going forward. We've provided some pre-development funds, which is part of our program that we're able to provide small grants to do that. We helped him find an architect and an engineer that he's comfortable with, but that we also think are experienced enough and up to the task of a pretty complicated, not a huge rehab, but a complicated rehab, which is an area of the market that can often be difficult to find design professionals who are willing and anxious to work in. And then we're helping him put together his capital stack. So we helped him apply for some grants from PHFA, including the FAIR grant. Shameless plug to any PHFA staff that's watching. Please move this to the top of the pile. And we're now working with him. We put out we drafted for him an RFP to try to find a construction firm now that'll serve in a CM role going forward. And so we're helping him select that contractor as well. So he's in control, but there are a lot of sort of technical tasks that guy that spends 50 hours a week cutting hair isn't going to have the time to get to. And I'll just go one more here. So we're into the sort of schematic design phase, but this is just the initial rendering, so you can see sort of what this will look like. So I will stop there. This is my contact information, but I'm excited to open it up for questions here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Matt. You guys are doing incredible work, and it actually spurred a lot of questions for me. But before I get to those, we do have a couple of questions coming in. I'm going to just kind of go in the order that I'm receiving them. And then Matt, if you could, perfect. So the first question that came in is, what kind of financial support is needed to make equitable planning a reality? And I'm really glad that question was asked, because I think we, as we go through 2021, we need to be thinking very carefully about equitable recovery. Matt, you made mention of this being another trauma for some of these communities. So what kind of financial support, not just, more money, but how does that money need to flow so that we can actually plan our communities in an equitable way? I'll either one of you could take that question.
I'll jump in. I'll just say that, I think that a lot of the, it's a balance between two things. A lot of the traditional credit measures that are used or typical ways that we structure debt financing or expect equity returns don't work. The example I just used, that's a building that, hopefully will appraise at $750,000, and it's going to take $1.25 million to rehab. That's a huge gap, especially on a percentage basis. So it needs subsidy. That being said, we can't be totally reliant on grants either, because that's simply not sustainable and not how we're going to achieve things at scale. So we're looking at things like how can we advocate for and even facilitate more financing that's based on cash flow, or financing that's based on an expectation of property appreciation rather than the current value of the property, guarantees or other kinds of credit enhancement that would help a developer get access to capital now, and then sort of, for lack of maybe this is inartful to say, but figure out repayment later.
And Councilmember Gerlach, did you want to jump in on that at all?
Not that one, but the next one,
Okay.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So the next question I have, actually, I think this question might have been directed towards you, Matt, but I'll let you both answer it. As you mentioned in your remarks, Matt, you are working with some developers that are led by people of color, but as we know, people of color make up a really small fraction of leaders in the development and just development industry, but more broadly, the real estate industry. So, what kind of legislative fixes are out there that can help build that talent pipeline and help encourage more development through firms led by people of color? So, Matt, and then Councilmember Gerlach.
Yeah, I think I'm going to let Cece, you talk about the legislative fixes, because I think that's maybe more your area of expertise. I really this is becoming a very chicken or the egg situation, where I think every time we see a developer of color or somebody that works for a CDC that's very talented, they become a almost a very coveted talent at that point, and which is great news. But it also puts an incredible, I think, strain on the system and just on that individual, and expectations become very high. So I only know it as a problem. I don't have the solution yet, but it's certainly something that, from a systemic perspective, I think that these are the kind of things where philanthropy could really help, is to invest in the very early stage talent development and things of that nature, rather than always trying, we always tend to try to have them try to sort of band-aid at the project level.
So I guess I would jump in and say that legislatively, I think what's important is that all developers are held to the same standard in terms of needing to have whatever documentations and I's dotted and T's crossed. What I have found is that in the past, not saying now, but in the past, we have had a developer of color, and the perception amongst some was that the standard was raised a bit, that the bar was raised a bit for this individual. Meanwhile, we've had other developers who are not of color who seem to just get like the red carpet rolled out. So making sure legislatively that whatever board, commission, authority is actually saying yay or nay is holding everyone to to that same standard, and not making it a harder stretch for some folks, because especially in a town, I don't know about like Pittsburgh and Philly, but in Allentown, it's all who and it tends to be, we've had developers who have been here for a while and people are comfortable with them, but then when folks maybe from the outside come in and folks maybe are not as comfortable with them, that could play in to decision making. But then in terms of like the pipeline, that's again where I get into policy, where if we are giving tax breaks, tax incentives for large corporations to come in, and if that's the type of work they do, architectural work, development, what would it look like through policy to say, hey, if you're going to come in here and get these tax breaks, you're going to have to invest in the local public school system and get some of our young people to get into these professions. So to me, again, it goes back to policy. It's not just asking, it's not just hoping, it's actually, putting it in law, like this is what you must do.
Great. Councilmember Gerlach, while you have the floor, there's a great question here for you. It says, how can the members of the Alliance and its partners help create some of these neighborhood community councils and ensure that those community impact reports you discussed and community-based organizations are part of development?
Yeah, I think one way is really helping municipalities, helping council members and commissioners, the local legislative bodies, really understand legally what we are able and not able to do in terms of the municipal planning code, especially those of us who are third-class cities and don't have some of the same powers and opportunities as like a Philly or a Pittsburgh. So I would say the Alliance helping to provide the kind of like the legal guidance for us in terms of what we can and can't do. But then beyond that, really accumulating the best practices, because I have had a hard time trying to find a city where they've done a CIR in the way I'm seeing it. I've found CIRs that have been done, say, for a large retail store like a Walmart or something, but that was very site specific, project based. The way I'm looking at it is more of a law that a municipality would pass, and so that has not. I can't quite find that. So if the Alliance would be able to kind of pull in best practices and see how could that happen? How could a CIR interface with a planning commission, with a zoning board? Because I will tell you, at the local level, when you're a member of council or you're on some legislative body, you're just one of seven. And it can be difficult to sometimes push the envelope to the next level versus an Alliance. You've got some more clout.
That's great. Thank you. There's another question that we have here. I love this question because it really gets into some of the idiosyncrasies of how this work is done. It says, many of the challenges seem to be regional, like in Allentown or Pittsburgh, but so often the tactics you use to address those challenges are local, that happen at the city or even neighborhood level. The question is, do you agree with that? And if so, is this a disconnect that you think is being addressed?
So I'll jump in. I totally agree with it. Our program, we call it the Centralized Real Estate Accelerator because it's intended to centralize knowledge capital and data for multiple neighborhoods, in and around the city of Pittsburgh. Because often CDCs or small developers tend to have their view of just their neighborhood. I think what the question is getting at, which I fully agree with, is why can't we sort of take that same model statewide, or call it Rust Belt wide, or whatever you want? Because I think again, this goes back to the difficulty in finding good talent is, there's not a lot that's different other than knowing the idiosyncrasies of local code or zoning or whatever. Once you get past that, Allentown and Pittsburgh are pretty similar, and Pittsburgh and Indianapolis are probably pretty similar. And so why can't we network a little bit better? So I fully agree, but it's something I think they're probably having the same exact conversation at the Michigan Housing Alliance conference, whenever that is. So yeah, we got to figure that out.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, as I've networked with other members of council in Pittsburgh, Philly, Erie, Scranton, Reading, Lancaster, the problems are similar, if not sometimes the same. And that's actually, it would be great for some of these problems that do have more of a statewide legislative change that's needed for us to do that networking and that collaborative kind of advocacy work. Because what I found is that some of these, like I said, some of these issues can be tackled at the local level in terms of legislation and policy and advocacy, but some of the things that we need to happen have to at the state level. And the only way that's going to happen is if we are on one accord, if it's third class cities and first class and second class cities all teaming up, saying together to our state legislators, like, hey, this law needs to change, this policy, this practice, this funding, whatever it is, has to change because it's affecting all of us. So, I mean, that's what I'm kind of reading into the question on how we could actually coordinate and advocate
Mhm.
together. I mean, homelessness is homelessness, no matter if it's in Franklin County, PA, or if it's in Lancaster, or Allegheny. A person is homeless, that needs to be solved. So I mean, on some broad areas like that, I just wish that there were more opportunities like this to really engage with one another, because our problems are so similar.
Councilmember, I want to actually go back up to some of your remarks on resident engagement. You said something that struck me, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing here. You said something like development should not happen to a community, but rather with a community. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you balance that resident engagement and community input with any kind of pushback you might get in some neighborhoods. And, to be frank, in many places, it's NIMBYism, where wealthy single family neighborhoods are against change because there might be some kind of investment in maintaining patterns of residential segregation. How do you balance getting that feedback and that input, but then also knowing sort of where to push back or draw the line and do what is best for the community?
Right. I mean, that's definitely a valid question, especially in Allentown as we explore opening up a year-round homeless shelter. Um, that NIMBYism is going to be alive and well. So I honestly, I don't know if I have a clear, succinct answer for that, because we have not even began that process yet. But I would say that if we as a city are operating with core values of inclusion and equity and valuing diversity, and if we are approaching these community groups with those core values and saying like, hey, this is what we believe, this is what we value, um, that could be a start. How would that play out? I have no idea, but I think it's all about the city taking the lead and from the get-go, saying like, this is what we value. And if there are some community members that maybe their needs and desires don't quite mesh with those values, and they don't quite align with whatever strategic plan you're working on, well, then yeah, I think, well, that's a conversation on how to address that community. But I don't have a specific answer on that.
That was great. I don't think anyone has the answer to it, but getting your thoughts is great. Matt, did you have anything you wanted to add to that before I move on?
No, go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, actually, Matt, you mentioned in your presentation that over the last year with the movement for racial justice, we're seeing a lot of commitments from philanthropy and corporations around racial equity. What do you think, and I'd like you both to answer this question if you can, what do you think is the role for philanthropy in facilitating not just development, but it's specifically facilitating inclusive development and equitable growth? And what can that look like in practice?
Yeah, so from our perspective, I think the key is to invest in the systems level change. I think that as I said, this is somewhere that philanthropy has the luxury is too strong a word, but they have the ability to invest long term, and unlike and so I'm thinking here of true sort of foundation philanthropy, unlike maybe corporate philanthropy where they need to see results of their commitment or their investment within 6 months or a year or 18 months. That's the expectation, right? And so that means sort of looking at shovel-ready projects, or the example I gave of a developer is going to be able to use the capital really quickly. What the other kind of philanthropy can do is really prep the ground around capital absorption to make sure that there are more organizations like us that are trying to build skills and talent, that there's more investment in credit unions and CDFIs and institutions like that to make access to capital easier and to not make people reliant on banks or equity investors. So that is I think a more appropriate role for them to remain big picture and thinking long term.
Yes, I would say first off would be ensuring, if it is like an organization, if it's a philanthropic organization that, has a mission statement and a vision and maybe even a board, that board is representative of the community. Far too often they are not. And again, it's not about tokenism. It's not about, we'll get one person of this ethnic background or this sexual orientation, and we've cured racism and sexism. No, it's about getting a cross section of people from within even one racial or ethnic group. So that you can get those multiple perspectives, because far too often the people who are making the decisions don't have that lived experience and don't have that true connection with the community. So I would say, as we strive to be more equitable and as we strive to break down some of these structural systems, the people who have been most impacted, the people who are closest to the pain, need to be closest to the power. And I think that's the direction that we've got to move in. And then I would say, furthermore, making sure that the philanthropic work that's being done is in conjunction with the vision. Some cities don't have a strategic plan or like a vision that they're working towards, but for those that do, instead of here, we're going to what happens far too often is I see like some philanthropic members of the community, here's water bottles at a block party, or here, we'll fix your fence. But that's not, it's good, it looks good, but it doesn't structurally change anything. It just feels good for that moment in the photo op. So I would say really taking guidance from, if it's not the city, nonprofits who are in the trenches doing the work, and having them guide their efforts in terms of where they're donating their money. But the most important thing would be to make sure the people who have actually lived through the structural systemic racism and sexism and homophobic policies, that they are the ones who are driving the philanthropic investment.
I just want to echo real quick the point about boards, because I think it's so important, and a place where funders really can like pull the strings, right? I think usually, and I get this, it's the executive director or the, program team that sort of gets all the attention, and that's who you think as a funder you're investing in. But, we all ought to pay more attention to who's on the board, because they might be there longer. And they are, they have the actual fiduciary responsibility.
Those are really concrete feedback and ideas. I appreciate that. Thanks. Another question we got here, I'm just going to read it to you. It says, are there any legislative laws to provide a preference, whether it be in affordable housing, development opportunities, employment opportunities, for people of color in a minority neighborhood in order to keep them from displacement? And I think here it'd be helpful to hear of any, legal interventions that can be used to not only prevent displacement, but make sure that people of color get to benefit from the growth and development that happens in their communities.
So sure. So some of the policies that I think of off the bat to prevent the displacement, and whoever commented is right. Usually it is people of color who are displaced, especially low income people of color. So some of these policies I think of, I spoke about earlier with community benefits, ordinances more so than agreements, community impact reports, but then policies like that we need to at least explore, and I know they have some downfalls to them, things like inclusionary zoning, things like landlord relocation, which is we're exploring right now, where when a landlord, when their property is tagged and it's uninhabitable, that landlord has to cover the relocation cost of that tenant, so that tenant does not become homeless. Exploring things like I know it's has some negative connotations, but rent stabilization. What could that look like in a community post-COVID, especially? So I mean, I think the policies are out there. It's just that for some of them, they've been enacted, like things like rent control, and there are some negatives. There are some downsides to them, but I forget the saying about throwing the bath out with the water. Like, we don't have to do that. Just because there are some negatives to some of the policies doesn't mean that the policy in general doesn't work. I think it's about finding that perfect combination of maybe some inclusionary zoning, some rent control, some community benefits ordinances that actually combined will actually provide some benefit to the residents. And then beyond that, making sure that as cities, we have requirements to contract with minority-owned businesses. Not all cities do, and ensuring that in order to grant projects proposals, proposed projects, that they must also contract and subcontract with minority-owned businesses, legislatively ensuring that.
Yeah, I would just add, we think a lot about, so inclusionary zoning, loop, long-time owner occupant protection. So dealing with people whose assessed values are going up, how do you sort of help them with their taxes? And then sort of right of first refusal if an apartment building is going up for sale. These are, I think, all really valuable policies and achievable policies. They're not explicitly geared toward people of color, right? But so you have to sort of make that leap that if you're gearing them toward communities that are predominantly people of color, or just the natural, to Cece's point, that it's usually people of color, low income people that are being displaced. So it's not quite as explicit as maybe the questioner is asking for, but I think there are important things to look at, and I think they've mostly gotten a lot of play and attention in big cities along the coast, and probably I'm sure that the advocates in those communities feel like it was too late, and it's not too late for us yet in Pennsylvania, although it's probably close. I do think that Philadelphia did a right of notice essentially for apartment buildings where affordability requirements were going to expire. But we need to get those in place now. We've got one neighborhood in Pittsburgh that has an inclusionary zoning overlay because it's a neighborhood that's experiencing a lot of gentrification. So now is the time for all of us before it's too late.
Great. We only have 2 minutes left, so I have one final question that I'm going to use to kind of get your last thoughts, and I'm going to put you both a little bit on the spot here. But for everybody who's listening, whether they are a developer, a resident services organization, whatever the case may be, what do you think is one question everyone can go back to their offices or to their homes and ask themselves to kind of challenge themselves and gut check themselves and make sure that when they are making decisions and doing their work, they're truly taking an equitable and inclusive approach to the work that they're doing? And I'll just open it up to both of you.
Sorry, I'll go first. The question that I like to ask myself when thinking, if it comes to a client or a project that I'm unsure about, is it going to contribute to recycling wealth within a community, or is it going to be extractive? Is it going to take wealth out of a community? However you want to define wealth for that particular project or in your own mind, I think is up to you. But that's the test I use, and I think it's often centering.
Great. Council member?
I would say, who's not here? Who's not at the table? Who are we missing? And why are we missing them?
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both so much for taking the time. Your insight has been just so invaluable. I know that folks who are listening have been expressing in their comments their appreciation for your time. So I think with that we are at time, and we will conclude the session. So again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Flora. Thanks, everyone.